recording and starting with this. Okay, before we start, tonight is Rosh Chodesh Av, and literally half an hour ago, I happened to come across this from Chabad. I thought it was brilliant. Zalacha, which is in white, bold. Mishanichnas Av nima'atim besimcha. When you enter the month of Av, you diminish your happiness. Doesn't mean you don't have happiness all the time. There should be, but you lessen it for the month of Av. What they added in here is Mishanichnas Av. When you enter the month of Av, nima'atim et hama'asim, you minimize the actions, atchushot, and the feelings, atchushot hashliliim, and the negative feelings, be'emtzaut simcha. By using simcha, you use that to cast away your negative feelings and actions with simcha, which is a basic tenet of Chabad. I just thought it was very nice to share that. I want to start off with a very weird, honestly, very weird thing. Let me find where I have it here. Yes. Actually, just a second. Give me one more second to get this set up. And this one, starting with this. Come on. Okay, make this big. Okay. Coming back here to share with sound. If you have a very good memory, now where did it go? Here. No. My apologies. Where the heck is it? For class. Oh, okay. Not going to start this yet. If you have a very good memory, you'll remember that when we started the very first class, I started off with a picture of Cholent. So I said, it's a very weird way to start a class, a new class having to do with history. I said that history is not just names, dates, and places, but it's also the life that's woven in to the whole fabric of Jewish history or any kind of history, and how Cholent was a demarcation line when it came to the people who were followers of Karaite Judaism and Shabtai Tzvi and other people, and how that made a distinction inside Yagon and have come up with the idea of Cholent. Okay, I'm going to show you a video. It's like 3 minutes long. You're going to watch about a minute and a half of it. Bear with me, and then I'll explain why. Commercial. Okay. Before you think I'm going off the rails and like, what's he talking about? Why am I showing you this thing with Lego? This is I think, a very good representation of where we are holding right now in Jewish history. Over the past few months, going back at least 8 months, probably longer, there were pieces of Lego that we were starting to gather. Each one, there were yellows and there were reds and there were blues and there were instructions and they were all individual modules. Then they sometimes came together. For example, the Jews and the Pale of Settlement, or the history of Zionism. They came and they made this grouping. Tonight, we're going to see, we saw a little bit last week, we're going to see tonight even more so. We're going to start putting these chunks together, all these different pieces, all these Lego pieces that form this subset we're going to now put together as the ship. That was my mashal that I wanted to start off with tonight. I got a thumbs up. All right, thank you very much. I got that. All right, my evening's already good. Okay, so we're going, let me just close this here from my screen, just a minute, because we're coming back to something here in a few minutes, actually very shortly. Let's see one more very short video. What we're going to do tonight is to look at two categories of people. We're moving into, we started last week, more so, especially tonight, we're moving into the category of how we talk a lot about World War I without the Jews' involvement, meaning not from a Jewish perspective at all. And now we're going into we did a little bit last week of where the Jews were physically, what was happening with them, what the trials and tribulations, which was a little bit of a repeat from a few months ago. Tonight, we're going to take a look at various, I want to say countries, but I'll use the word countries because it's more of areas, where the Jews actually served as soldiers in World War I, why they served, how they served, what were the ramifications sometimes to their service, for good, the bad, and the ugly. In order to understand one specific, not to order to understand, but I'm going to show you something that's 52 seconds long. What'll get us started with German Jews. And let's say I'm gonna kind of introduce this whole section a little bit differently now, also besides the Lego mashal, and that is to say, when Jews participate in their national something. Let's say Americans do something in America, and German Jews do something in Germany, and Australian Jews something do in Australia that has to do with their country. They may have a similar idea. They may be celebrating something similar, but they have a different reason they may be celebrating. Maybe patriotism, maybe whatever. The Jews in all the countries we're going to talk about, and one is a subsection, which is the Pale of Settlement, had different motivating factors into why they decided to go and enlist, or sometimes they were conscripted, but to go and enlist into the army of their host country, or their homeland, into World War I. So the first thing I want to show you is, the first and last thing I want to show you as far as a video, again, very short, like 52 seconds. I'm going to watch. Nope. Okay, make it big. And I'm actually going to slow it down just a little bit.
Most welcome to Historiespanarna, History Reconnaissance. This time we take you to Berlin in Germany and the spirit of 1914, or what the Germans called Augusterlebnis. Crowds were cheering, and it was a sense of euphoria when the soldiers marched off to war. The string of victories in the first weeks of August 1914 also reinforced the belief of a short and glorious war. Any possible dissent was swept away or kept inside in fear of undermining the support for the loved ones at the front lines. The images that follow are from a Swedish newsreel of the time.
Okay, I'll explain to you what you were watching and why it's important. Let me just close it on my screen and put this up here. This, okay. World War I had broken out already. 3 weeks in, and Germany had some significant gains in the early part of very beginning of World War I. And because of that, there was this feeling of tremendous patriotism within Germany that started to swell, and people wanted, by the thousands, wanted to join the army. By doing so, they would show their patriotism to their fatherland or their motherland, depending on where you're talking, because Germany and Russia and all had different titles or different relationship, whatever you want to call it. And they had something called Augusterlebnis. Augusterlebnis meant an August experience. And people, not just Jews, people were getting swept up into the patriotism, and they felt it was going to be a very short war because look at all the gains they made so quickly. And German Jews enthusiastically embraced this war. They were they wanted to, but why did they want to embrace this war? It wasn't they necessarily believed in the value or the goals of the war. They wanted to prove something. And this we're going to see come through with a few of these countries. They wanted to prove their complete loyalty to Germany. Approximately 100,000 German Jews served in World War I. Unfortunately, 12,000 were killed. And their service really did show a tremendous conviction for what they were going through, that they were fully German. So as they go through the war, the German soldiers who are Jewish, number one, are showing their country, see, we can be Jews and still be good Germans. And then number two, they're showing their true patriotism, and they're proving to themselves in theory, and here's where the denial comes in, that you see, everything's great. We do know that this whole idea will be dispelled as we get closer to World War II in the interwar years. So that's just briefly about German Jews. The French Jews we have to look at now from a different perspective. They enter the war in a different, the French Jews enter the war in a different state of mind, which was shaped by the Dreyfus Affair. Again, tonight you're going to hear, going back to, for you came in late, you'll watch the tape. There was a video I showed at the beginning of a man putting together a 9,000 piece Lego of the Titanic. And I was saying that what we're doing is putting some of those pieces now into groups and making a big chunk of past classes. The topics that we're going to talk about tonight were briefly discussed or at length discussed in the past. And now we're going to try and put them all together, or many of them. So French Jews enter the war in the particular state of mind, which was the Dreyfus Affair. It had bitterly, as you remember, divided French society, not just the Jews themselves, but the Jews versus non-Jews, the tremendous anti-Semitic prejudice that came up in the trial and then subsequently that spread into France, which led to the direct consequence of the Zionist movement being founded by Theodor Herzl, which again, we don't need to go into the whole story again. French Jewish leaders spent years after the Dreyfus Affair trying to demonstrate their loyalty and their patriotism, and would appear, they thought, that this war was going to give them that opportunity. German Jews, let's go back for a second. The German Jews enter out of complete patriotism. They were, in some cases, looked down as second-class citizens. There was no pogroms, or there was no, obviously Nuremberg laws. That's all coming up many years later when it comes to before World War II. And so they want to go and show their patriotism. They want to show their loyalty. The French Jews want to do even more than that. They're coming on a cloud that's over them of all the anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, and because of the Dreyfus Affair. So they felt that this would be the definitive proof. You see, we're Jews. We have no part in the Dreyfus Affair. We're not like him. We're not like that. We are good French citizens. And they served in the French army. Many were killed. Many were decorated soldiers as well. It temporarily muted the French anti-Semitism, which reached tremendous a peak in the mid to late 1890s, before World War I. So that's the German Jews and the French Jews. Now it gets a little bit more complicated because both of those willingly joined. They wanted to prove something. That's not a good reason to join a war, but that's what they did. The Jewish soldiers in the Russian army is a different world altogether. I may have told this story in one of the classes over the time period we've had in this class. My father's father. My name is Zev Meir. So Zev was my grandfather, who passed away when he was 43. And my great-grandfather was Meir. So Meir but they wanted to conscript him to the Russian army. And I have a great aunt who's no longer alive. That was his sister, and was her father, and she remembered that when he made Kiddush Friday night, he held the coast like this, like I do too. Many people do, but the reason it is he didn't have a thumb. He cut it off because he didn't want to be conscripted into the army. So it is in this kind of situation, the Jewish soldiers in the Russian army are qualitatively different than what we saw from the German Jews and the French Jews. They were conscripted. They didn't line up to fight the Tsar's army. They were conscripted in very large numbers. Approximately 500,000 Jews were conscripted into the Russian army. Now, when you are conscripted into the Russian army, it did not mean you got, we went for 3 years and you got home for weekends. You could be in for 25 years and you could start as young as a child. They didn't care. Didn't make a difference if you were Jewish, not Jewish. That was their rule, 25 years in some cases. But they served in an army for a state that regarded them with tremendous suspicion, and they denied the Jews any rights to become officers in almost every branch of their army. They were subjected to anti-Semitic harassment from their officers, from their fellow soldiers, and in many cases, they treated the populations in the areas that the army moved through as potential enemies rather than loyal subjects. So the first thing we have to understand is that the Jews who are going into the Russian army, number one, they didn't choose to do it. They're not looking to prove anything. They'd rather just kind of laid low. Number two, they're treated with as much, if not more, anti-Semitism as soldiers than they were in their homes. But it was shaped by a very specific attitude. And the attitude was that it was institutionalized anti-Semitism. Again, we talked about this before, that it wasn't that, there were thugs in the streets and just spontaneously there were pogroms in the cities. No, it was institutionalized, enshrined almost in basic law, using our terminology today, that you kill Jews or you harass Jews, you cause them problems. It was impossible for Jews, whatever they did, to be regarded completely as Russian or loyal Russians. It wasn't going to happen. So they already started with 3 strikes against them before they even walked into the battlefield. It's German, it's French, that's Russian. What about British and American forces? Britain had approximately 50,000 Jews that fought in the war, in the armed services under the British flag, so to speak. But they also faced their own form of loyalty question if they're loyal British citizens, because Britain was at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So if Britain's at war with Austria-Hungary and Germany, what's the problem with that? Why is there a question about their loyalty? Because most of the people who are in England at this time, most of the Jews, are in fact immigrants from Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this question it has today, the exact question we have today, and whether it's in the United States, it's in Australia, it's in New Zealand, it's in Canada, it's in many countries, of quote dual loyalty of the Jew. That is he loyal more to Israel, or is he more loyal to his host home country? I say home instead of host, although I probably should say host. It makes more sense. So this idea of the questioning of their loyalty was in fact something that goes back to this moment in time, even earlier. And we're not talking about Tsarist Russia. We're talking about England during the beginning of World War I. Sorry, 1 second. Just make sure it's not a okay. First, I thought we were getting an early alert. It's just a phone call. And the press, the Jewish press, that's the lowercase p. It's not the Jewish press with a capital P. The Jewish press tried to make it very clear as they were writing stories about their citizens, the Jewish citizens who are going to war on behalf of the country, that they were loyal and their military participation, and that's what they really wanted to do. They actually established what became known as the Jewish Legion. It was a separate Jewish fighting unit that served in Palestine. And yes, at that time period, until May of 1948, this region was called Palestine. Not to be confused with the pretend country that some Arabs want to make up. Um, Bummer, too bad for that. Um, and it gave them an opportunity. It gave them an effort also to give the Zionists specifically a means of fighting Jewish national goals while serving the Allied cause at the same time. So now what we have here is we have Jews doing a few things in World War I. Number one, they're fighting for their host country on behalf of the British. They themselves are British. There's a little suspicion though about them, about the dual loyalty. They have a specific legion. Again, is the Jewish Legion that is fighting in Palestine on behalf of the British, and at the same time that enables them to help the Zionist machine, so to speak, try to help fellow Jews in their national goals, their goals of a national country, national homeland. A couple names which we have not talked about, except maybe I touched on briefly. Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor were among the organizers of this effort, and the Jewish Legion would become one of the founding myths of revisionist Zionism. What's revisionist Zionism? We talked about that also, which I'm not going to get into details now. You can always go back to videos of earlier classes on the history of Zionism. But again, there's another piece. So all these questions that we discussed before, which we're coming up to a big one soon, the dual loyalty, the Dreyfus affair, the situation of the Zionist movement in France, the whole idea of the Dreyfus affair feeding the more anti-Semitism and feeding Theodor Herzl, which brings about the Zionist movement. These all start to come into a head and to come to focus, all with the beginning of World War I. American Jews there were approximately 2.5 million Jews in America at the time. We're talking 1914, predominantly recent immigrants, the Russian Empire, Eastern Europe, but there were some older German Jews as well, German Jewish community, which we also spoke about. This whole thing, we talked about the Ellis Island, and we talked about all this time period. Their position into their entry into the war was very conflicted. Why are the American Jews conflicted to fight on the American side at the beginning of World War I? Remember, we saw last week, America wasn't at the very beginning of World War I. The whole series of events we talked about last week brought America into the war, just like you'll see that America comes into World War II with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 7th. There were these events that we talked about last week that brought the Americans in, but the Jews going into the American army to serve in World War I, there's a conflict. Why? On the one hand, most of them despised Tsarist Russia. It's the country they came from. Their families fled because of pogroms. But at the same time, Russia was on their side. They were an ally. They couldn't stomach the idea of fighting. They're not like fighting for the United States. They're fighting for the Allied forces. And part of the Allied forces is Russia, Tsarist Russia, the very same country that murdered them and raped them and burned them and threw them out of the country and caused them all kinds of problems. Some even sympathized with Germany, not out of German nationalism whatsoever, but understanding that the German defeat of Russia could helpfully maybe to liberate the Jews of the Pale of Settlement. We talked at length last week about Pale of Settlement, or a while ago, and we're going to look a little bit more tonight about Pale of Settlement because that's going to be a very important part here. But understand this is such a mind-blowing idea. You know, people know Americans served in Jewish Americans served in World War I. People know that there were Jews that were killed, unfortunately, from America in World War I. But to understand the conflict is unbelievable because it brings into focus the things we've been talking about, that, yeah, we're going to fight on the side of the Americans who are allied with Russia, the same Russia that messed with us. But wait a minute, at the same time, we want to sympathize a little with Germany. We don't like Germany, but we hope they beat the daylights out of Russia because that'll free up the whole Pale of Settlement, and the relatives who are there under their rule would be freed. So it's a very difficult situation mentally for them to go into this war. Their divided loyalty, this would actually become a very big issue in relationship between American Jews and the broader American public, and would eventually help shape a very strong bias, let's say, of political behavior throughout the war years. And I may add, up till this very day. There's no question about it. You can read, all you need to do is read just a few articles of current events, and eventually at some point the concept of dual loyalty comes up. So we talked about French Jews, German Jews, we talked about the Russian Jews, talked United States and England. These are the people who actually went to war. What about civilians? What was going on with them? What was what were they experiencing in these different places? So let's say out of 2.5 million Americans who live there, X amount we said went overseas to fight. Now you still have probably a couple million Americans in the United States. What are they sitting there, polishing cutting their nails and filing their nails? What's going on with them? So we're going to take a look at first one of the probably the biggest areas of catastrophe for the Jews who were just civilians. And we're going to take a look at the Pale of Settlement again from a different perspective. I'm going to put on the screen for a moment, just again for a refresher. Let me find here. Where'd it go? Hang on, give me one more second. I want this. Right. Okay, let me share this screen with you now. Share. Just as a reminder, because I know we talked about this, let's make it a little bigger. Okay, the Pale of Settlement. This is an area in which the Jews were relegated to live in Tsarist Russia. You have Russia over here, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and they're in the middle here. Now, what's important to understand is, I'll kind of just jump ahead for a moment. Many of you, myself included, are asked sometimes, like, so where do your ancestors come from? So mine, I mentioned last time, my father's father came from Gomel or Homel, depending how you pronounce it, came from over here. The question was, what country was it in? Now, because of the eastern border over here of the Pale of Settlement went through so much, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, that the border kept shifting between whose country. Was it Poland? Was it Russia? Was it Austria-Hungary? So it was all different possibilities. So depending on what day of the week, the Gomel may have been in this country. It may have been part of this country, may have been part of who knows? So, but this is a very good percentage of our fellow Jews here and in Chutz La'aretz can trace their roots back to their relatives here in the Pale of Settlement. Was the second one was here afterwards. We're going to come back to this when we get to Galicia. Okay. So let's continue talking now about the Pale of Settlement. The Jewish civilians in the Pale of Settlement were experiencing something that has no parallel in any Western experience of war. Remember, you can't separate the fact that the countries we're talking about were at war. And the Jews who are not going out, who were not conscripted into the Russian army, are in the Pale of Settlement. There was the repeated, kind of like made mention now just a second ago, repeated conquest, occupation, the reconquest of the very territories they were living in. Imagine you live in Yerushalayim. I don't want to use Yerushalayim. It's a terrible example. A person lives in let's talk southern Los Angeles, and there's a war, and Mexico goes to war, and they capture part of Southern California, and they retreat, and then another country nearby, there isn't really one exactly there, it conquers them, and they retreat. So depending on the day of the week, you don't know who your ruler is, you don't know your borders, you don't know who you're paying taxes to, who are you supposed to pay your arnona to, whatever it might be. It's a ridiculous example, but it was constantly changing. The Pale of Settlement was situated in the center of the Eastern Front. So therefore, it constantly was changing hands, especially in the eastern part of the Pale of Settlement. When the Russians invaded Galicia, so those of you who are Galicianer Jews and have the Galicianer Jew in your background, we're going to take a look at that in a few minutes. Russians invaded Galicia as the Germans and Austro-Hungarians pushed the Russians back. And a retreat, there's a reverse situation in 1916. The Russians created a new chaos in 1917. All the time, while this whole thing, if you just picture that map for a second in your mind, there's the constant pull of the Jews' territory being under one or an opposing force. And everybody who occupied that land, i.e., Russia or whoever it was, I'm going to list the list again, all of them and every one of them regarded the Jews with tremendous suspicion. They are the dregs. They are the lowest. They are the bottom of the barrel. Again, these are themes that are going to come up and with tremendous force just before and, of course, during World War II. The physical destruction was enormous. Towns and villages were shelled and burned and looted, and they were reoccupied over the 4 years of the war. What happened to day-to-day life? What happened to day-to-day life in the Palestine while all this is going on? So you can only imagine that small-scale commerce in the Pale was shattered. The economy was in tatters. The infrastructure of the Jewish community itself was disrupted. It was destroyed. Shuls, schools, charitable organizations, anything you could think of the infrastructure, mutual aid was falling apart because of this constant turmoil. Let's put it in a different perspective for a moment. People who live in the north here and people live in the south, what their lives were for 2 years, less so in the north until it starts heating up north, but especially down south, what it was like with the beginning of the war. Yeah, of course, before the war, with all the missiles from Hamas, Yimach Shemam, of course, how their lives were disrupted, how their businesses were closed, how they were evacuated to hotels all over the country. Think about people within your own families. My own family, people served hundreds and hundreds of days in Miluim, and what it did for people who own their own private business or their employees of another business. The disruption is immense, but at least when they come home, there's a country, there's a government, there's a structure, there's something. Here, the same thing was happening, obviously different ways, but again, their lives are thrown into turmoil, and they don't know what's going on. What about the Russian military police relative to the average Jew in the Pale settlement? We already said that when the Jews were in the army, that the relationship to them was very much institutionalized anti-Semitism. But that's exactly what's happening, of course, back home to the citizens in the Pale. There's a deliberate campaign of prosecution, or persecution, I guess is the right word, of the Jews in the Russian by the Russian military themselves. They regarded them as a collective enemy. Now, just think about this for a second. Russia is an ally with the United States. There are Jews fighting for America, for Britain, for Germany, for Russia, who got conscripted. And yet, the Russians look at their people, the citizens, in quotes, because they weren't really citizens with full rights, in the Pale settlement, as a collective enemy. They could be why? Why could they be a collective enemy? Because they could be a potential spy for Germany, for Austro-Hungary. They could be saboteurs. They could be profiteers trying to exploit war at the Russian expense. After all, they're Jews, right? They only know one language. That's money. There were no basis, in fact, obviously, to all these accusations. There was zero. I can't say zero because you can never say something mukhlat like that because I don't know. There was almost no evidence of historical evidence of Jewish espionage. But the accusations, of course, that doesn't mean that people are not going to believe them. And of course, there's deep-rooted prejudice and anti-Semitism, Jew hatred behind them, and they're believed, and of course, with terrible consequences. Among those consequences was forced deportation of Jews from war zones. Starting in 1915, the Russian military forcefully expels Jews, huge populations from entire provinces, great brutality, no notice. It's the middle of winter. There's no provisions for housing or anything. They're just kicked out. You find somewhere, go somewhere. Families were separated, elderly and sick died, children died very young in large numbers, property confiscated or looted, shuls vandalized. If this sounds the least bit familiar to you, like I say, Ein kol chadash tachat hashamesh. There's nothing new under the sun. This is exactly what ends up happening, of course, leading up to and during World War II. Jews are forced out of their homes. We will meet a man named Grunschmann, whose family is deported from Poland, and how he does something, again, shooting somebody. I think the name of what man was Ernst Ralph, I think, who that has it kicks off part of the early day of world prior to World War II, but really Kristallnacht. It becomes almost a flame that ignites things. Again, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I just want you to understand that this is a cyclical thing. This is going to be something that will perpetuate. Remember, of course, go back with all the history classes we talked about. Jews are kicked out of Spain, they're kicked out of Portugal, they're kicked out of England, they're kicked out of restaurants nowadays. But it's happened. It happens for centuries already, and in almost it's almost that there's a playbook. You have to kill them or beat them. You kick them out of the country. You confiscate their valuables. You just demolish their shoals. The scale of these deportations and what it did to their lives was staggering. In 1915 alone, 500,000 to 600,000 Jews are expelled from their home in Lithuania and western provinces of the Pale. By the end of the war, almost 1 million Jews are forcibly displaced within the Russian Empire. So that's already bad enough. Keep in mind, the Jews have no homeland. There is no Israel. I mentioned already before that at the end of World War I and at the end of World War II, and especially World War II, the Poles went back to Poland, the Germans went back to Germany, the Italians went back to Italy, the Americans went back to America, and the Jews went back nowhere. They had no home. In the home. They were all forced out, just like this. Yes, we're talking World War II. That's the same idea. They're kicked out of Poland, they're kicked out of Germany, they're kicked out of France. Wherever they're being kicked out of, there's no home for them to go back to. Literally and figuratively, there's no home for them. So there's the DP camp, the displaced persons camps, which again, we'll get to. So things are goes from bad to worse. That in addition to these massacres, there are Russian troops who are attacking homes, burning, killing people. There's a town called Kuji, and it had a lot of small shtetl near it, and all of them experienced horrific violence from the Russian military. Again, these aren't the Russian people themselves. It included them, but it's being done by the Russian army, the military. So I'm going to pause here for a second so I don't forget way down the road. I'm going to mention this to you now. If you have a chance even now to do this, I recommend it. There's a book by a man named Jan Gross, spelled like Jan, J-A-N, Jan Gross. It's a little book, but I'm going to guess it's 100 pages, if that. It's called Neighbors. And it deals with a specific story, and you'll see why I'm mentioning this now. A specific story of a community called Jedwabne, J-E-D, Jedwabne, where the Jewish citizens of the community were rounded up. First, there are a lot of the Poles, it's in Poland, and the Poles themselves murdered and massacred a lot of Jews in the community. And then after, I don't remember how many days it was, they rounded them all up in a barn or some wooden building, sealed it, and burned it to the ground. I actually was there. I had seen this spot where this happened. And the book is called Neighbors because although Germany had already occupied Poland and already had set up labor camps and death camps already in the country, it was the average neighbor of the person, of the Jew, that was kicking them. The book describes about with the axes and the all kinds of horrific things. It was the average guy on the street of Poland who was doing this. On this exact trip, we were in a different village. It might actually have been in Jedwabne, I just don't remember. There was a woman, a Polish woman, who was probably 175 years old, who obviously was there in the time of the war. She said she had never left this particular city or village. And our guide asked her in Polish, could you tell us about the Jews that used to live in this community? And she said, Jews? There were never any Jews here. So it was like, not only were they all massacred and murdered, but also the historical record, the Jews, from their memory, there never any Jews here. Come back now to the Pale of Settlement. Come back to the Russian army. The throwing them out and destroying them and burning them and killing them, and raping and looting and all that. Same stories happening, more so by the Russian military by then the neighbors. Poland becomes the neighbors, and in many other communities. But it happens to be this one book by Jan Gross that I can't recommend enough. I read it. I'm a fairly fast reader. I read it on the bus ride to Jedwabne. I think it was from Auschwitz, but I don't remember for sure. It wasn't a very long ride. It was enough to read the entire book. So it's a difficult read, not because of the words, but because of the experience that you have when you read it. I mean, there's countless books to recommend on the Holocaust, but that's going to be the big problem when we get down to that topic. It's just trying to winnow out what we're going to learn about then. Okay. And even when it comes to World War I, as I mentioned to my wife recently, it's like going down a rabbit hole. You can see this and this. I can drill down to. I was reading the Pinkas. The Pinkas is like a notebook that each community had of who, like that took among many things, the census of the community. So doing research for this particular class, I went through the archives online and that of dozens of different communities, and they have in alphabetical order the name of the husband and the wife and the date they moved there and the whatever else information, and there's thousands of these things out there. You could also go into the National Library. You'll find these Pikasim. The other end of the spectrum is we call it a Yiskerbuch, or a Yisker book of communities that were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, if not thousands, that are memorial books that just paint the picture of what that community was before the Holocaust. Of course, there is Yafa Eliach's book, and because of that, they have a whole thing at Yad Vashem based on her book. Again, it's monstrous, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. The purpose of mentioning all this was about World War II, is that the similar items or events that are happening here replicate themselves into World War II. People think that the Nazis invented a lot of the stuff. There's nothing they did that wasn't done before, either in World War I or centuries before by the British, by the Spanish, by the Portuguese. It just, again, unfortunately, the list is endless. The fact that the persecution of the Russian Jews was taking place at the same time while Jews were serving in the Russian army is probably one of the most bitter ironies of all of World War I. What I want to do, I'm going to stop here. Bezrat Hashem, next week, I want to talk about the German occupation Pale of Settlement. Remember, they said that one of the things that the Americans were hoping would be was that Germany would occupy the Pale, because by doing so, they would be able to maybe free them from under the thumb of the Tsar. Is that what happened? Does not happen? If you want to find out, go online. You come back to class Bezrat Hashem next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful evening, and hope you have some Besorot Tovot.